Hi, I'm Grace Laudick, and this is Educating Ourselves in These Difficult Times on ThinkTech Hawaii. Today, we will be discussing racial and cultural relations on campus, the influence of the Black Lives Movement and protests across the nation, and civic engagement among students at a historically Black university in Texas. My guest today is Merritt Johnson, a senior at Texas Southern University in Houston. She is double majoring in political science and entertainment recording management and is also pursuing a minor in computer science. On campus, she is involved with a speech and debate team and had an internship with ABC News in September 2019 for the Democratic debates. She will be sharing her experiences as a college student in Southern Texas, give us some insight into Houston's current racial climate, and discuss how cultural and educational differences create the foundation for how we perceive and respond to global issues. So thank you for taking time to be a guest on my show today, Merritt.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, I'm really happy to be here.
Of course. So just to create some context for our viewers today, I was wondering if you could take a moment to share a little bit about Texas Southern University with us.
Texas Southern University is a HBCU, and that means historically Black college or university. It was founded in 1927. I believe it was called the Houston Junior College for Negroes, if I'm not mistaken. But then in 1946, it was officially established as a university because there was a student, if I'm not mistaken, Heman Sweat. I hope I didn't get that wrong, but he applied to University of Texas in Austin for the law school. He was rejected because he was African American, and he sued. And basically, the courts decided that he isn't allowed to go to UT, but they will establish a university in Texas for African American students. So in 1947, it became the Texas State University for Negroes. And then years later, it became Texas Southern University, which is what it is today.
So what exactly is a historically Black college or university, and what is the significance of that?
Well, historically Black college or university is basically the place where, because African American people were kept out of educational spaces like University of Texas, like University of Houston, we needed a place where we could educate our youth what their next steps would be. And historically Black colleges, the significance of them was a place where young Black people would go to further their education, get a higher education, vocational training, and where they could establish themselves and have degrees for the future and whatnot. It was the really only place Black students could go, and has served Black communities and other communities of color, because other communities of color have been denied for such a long time.
Mm-hmm. So if someone were to walk onto a historically Black college or university, what exactly would be the racial diversity breakdown on such a campus?
Okay, that's a good question. And I would say that it honestly depends on the campus, because not all HBCUs are built the same. You would think that all of them would be majority Black, which most of them are, but you definitely have a lot of diversity, especially when it comes to different people of Asian backgrounds. You have a lot of Arab people, a lot of Eastern Asian people that are, especially at my university, who are at Texas Southern. You have a strong Chinese influence at my university, and there are some HBCUs that are now majority white. But still have that HBCU historic foundation. So for the most part, you're going to find a lot of majority Black with a lot of ethnic diversity in the sense of people of color. And then on those few rare occasions, you're going to find majority white HBCUs. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to admissions for HBCUs, is there preference given for Black students especially, or is it an open admissions policy that gives equal preference for each student from different racial backgrounds?
Yeah, I think there definitely is a misconception that since it's an HBCU, they're going to prioritize Black people first, and that is not the case. I know since I've like talked to people in admissions, that is definitely not the case at Texas Southern, as far as I know. And as far as I know for other HBCUs, it's truly just open. If you want to come to this university, you have the academic requirements to get in, and that's that. They don't really preference Black people or whatnot. When it talks about like HBCU, it's more of the historic side, why this university is here, more than like we're only servicing certain groups of people.
Mhm. When it comes down to discussions about cultural and racial relations, especially at historically Black universities, I'd like to take the time just to compare and contrast the experiences that you had when you were a student at Hawaii Pacific University for your freshman year, and then the rest of your experiences that you've had throughout university while attending Texas Southern University. When it comes to discussions about racial and cultural diversity, perhaps if it comes down to class discussions about it, perhaps professor opinions on it, or just a general sentiment about students on campus, did you sense that there was perhaps a different approach to discussions about racial and cultural relations between HPU and at Texas Southern?
Mm, Okay. I would say that there definitely is a difference, well, because one is a predominantly Black school. So I guess in some ways, certain things that I would have to maybe explain about the Black community at HPU, I don't have to do that at all at Texas Southern because it's just kind of known. Or most people in the room will have shared experiences in that way. And I loved my time at HPU. I left for personal reasons mainly, but I think there is quite a difference I felt in the sense of like a culture shock because Hawaii on its own, HPU on its own, it's a very unique culture. I went from one unique culture to the unique culture of the HBCU campus. So I definitely had 2 rounds of culture shock. Um, with HPU, I was kind of one of the only Black students. So I kind of felt like I was always like explaining, oh, well, I don't speak for all Black people, but this is typically how it is in the Black community, or these are how these issues impact and whatnot. At the same time, I was learning a lot about cultures that I didn't know about being there. Um, at Texas Southern, in a way, I learned more about myself and my history in regards of being African American or being a Black woman, and just the differences between the two. I think, yeah, as I said earlier, they're just very unique.
Mhm. When it comes down to discussions in the classroom, comparing HPU to Texas Southern, would you say that one university seems to place more of an emphasis on discussing racial and cultural divisions?
Um, hmm. I honestly think that both universities, both at least my experiences at HPU and now at TSU, um, they've done both a really good job of talking about how race or ethnicity plays an impact in education or in daily life, because, as I mentioned, the unique cultures that both of these universities are placed in. I think that they do it from different angles, though. Clearly, the HBCU is going to talk more about a Black perspective, historically being Black in this country or in the United States. And for HBU, I found it more as a uh, more Asian centric perspective, which for me was honestly very enlightening because I had never really had that type of experience before or had that knowledge shared with me. So I think they both do justice to explaining these things just for different groups of people in the sense. Yeah.
Mhm. When it comes down to core curriculum, are there perhaps classes at Texas Southern University that focus on discussing racial and cultural divisions between people?
Okay, so I would say honestly, not really. That would probably go once you get into like your specific major or an elective, because TSU is a public university, HPU is a private. HPU definitely, I feel like, has more leniency on what they want to call their core requirements. I know while I was there, even though I didn't take these classes, several people I knew took classes about Hawaiian history and Hawaiian language, and just things that aren't really even in the sense of learning about the history of the university you're at or the people that surround the university. Those type of things aren't really at Texas Southern. It's just your standard history, US history, Texas history, math, poli sci. So I think honestly, HPU really had that in the bag.
You mentioned earlier that when you came to HPU, you often felt like you were the only Black woman in the room, and that you often had to go out of your way to explain about your experiences as a Black woman in the context of the modern United States. How could this transition perhaps have been made easier for you? Do you think that there are ways that they could have made it so that you could better acclimate to the campus culture at HPU?
That's an interesting question because sometimes sometimes when I look back on my experiences there, I wonder if, some of the things I experienced or some of the discomforts I may have had was that because I was just not used to, you know, expressing myself or expressing my how I feel in regards to my race or whatnot. But then again, when I look back at the same time, I really feel like that was stuff that was internal with me. And I feel like the campus atmosphere I had at HPU, it was incredibly welcoming. It was incredibly eclectic. And I thought that it was more of my progression as a young adult rather than it was anything that HPU had, my personal experience.
Mhm. For young adults who may similarly be struggling with their racial identity and learning how to comfortably express themselves in a new setting, what have you found to be helpful for yourself in learning how to become more comfortable with your racial identity and expressing yourself in new climates that perhaps you're not necessarily most comfortable with?
Ooh, okay. Yeah, that's a good question. Because to be honest, I'm still figuring that out. I go to an HBCU, but there are a lot of intricacies and complexities within the Black community in regards to a multitude of topics, from colorism to intrapersonal racism, a whole lot. So I think honestly, the best advice I can give someone is to educate themselves on where they come from. And not only a sense of like where you personally come from, your own experiences, but I feel I'm a strong believer in the idea that if you know the history of who you are or who your people are, you'll have more of a chance of really finding who you are today. That's kind of where I am right now. And I'm still figuring it out.
Mhm. So, Merritt, in a moment, we're actually going to be taking a short break.
Mhm.
Again, I'm Grace Laudick, and you're watching Educating Ourselves in These Difficult Times with my special guest, Merritt Johnson. We will be back shortly.
Aloha, I'm Catherine Knorr, the host of the new show, The Wide World of Esports, the show devoted to all things esports. The show will focus on esports business, law, games, athletes, teams, and everything esports. It airs on Wednesdays, and I look forward to sharing with you the wide world of esports. I'll see you on Wednesdays. Aloha.
Welcome back to Educating Ourselves in These Difficult Times with my guest, Merritt Johnson. I'd like to pick up where we left off before our break, Merritt, and just talking about your experiences as a Black woman in the Texas Southern community, as well as the community in Hawaii Pacific University. During our break, we actually had a question come up from one of our live viewers, and what she wanted to ask you is, did you experience any discrimination as one of the few Black students at HPU or in the Hawaii community? If so, what kind?
Well, specifically in HPU, I can unequivocally say not at all. I didn't feel any sort of discrimination or microaggressions, some people may describe it, from anyone at HPU or Hawaii Pacific at all. And that is, something I will say unequivocally as I say that again. But as Hawaii in general, from for the most part, no. To be honest, there's only one instance I can think of that I was like, whoa. And ironically, it didn't happen in Texas, even though I thought it would happen in Texas. The first time I've ever been called the N-word, it happened when I was leaving a Walmart, walking back to my dorm. It was some random gentleman. I'm not sure who he was. I'm not sure where he came from, but and I was actually wearing a African or a Afrocentric hairstyle, Bantu knots, which another one of the other Black students on campus did my hair for me. And yeah, that was kind of jarring. And I had never been called the N-word up in my entire life. And you think that growing up in Texas, that's probably where it would happen. But that's honestly the only thing though I can think of that. So like 99% of my experience there in Hawaii and Hawaii Pacific in regards to my race or anything of that nature was positive.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that you felt as though you would have been more subject to racial discrimination living in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
Would you describe Texas Southern University as perhaps a bubble from the greater culture of Houston and Texas? And what is the general sentiment in regards to racial and cultural diversity and relations in Houston compared to greater Texas?
Okay. Well, I would definitely describe Houston as a bubble, not just Texas Southern, because Houston, Texas, as you know, is a red state. Houston is one of the blue bubbles in a red state. And not to stereotype anyone who is conservative or conservative leaning, any of that nature, but Texas, as far as I know, we have the most KKK chapters, I think 22 or 23. So in these more liberal blue areas, especially Houston, we are a very ethnically diverse city. And maybe if you travel out farther to areas formerly known as sundown towns, which are just an hour and a half away from me, where if you're Black or person of color, but if you're specifically Black and the sun goes down on you, just some bad stuff will happen. So my experiences here in Houston, I would definitely say are more of a bubble-esque type. And that's not to vilify the rest of Texas because I love Texas, that's my home. But we definitely have a long way to go in the more rural parts of the state. And I live in a more rural area of the state in the greater Houston area, but even farther into the very rural, we definitely have a long way to go in terms of racial communication.
Mm-hmm. Especially in response to recent national events such as the strong resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as the recent death of George Floyd and the protests that have been occurring around the nation, what has been the response at Texas Southern University? Have you seen any instances of perhaps students garnering support for the Black Lives Matter movement, or perhaps has a statement been issued by the university to address the recent events?
Yeah, so as far as a statement from Texas Southern, I am not aware of one. If there is one, I'm just saying, I don't know if there is or isn't, but if there is one, I'm not aware. In regards to the community at large, this is, and I hate to say it, it's almost kind of like same thing, different day. And I think what happened to George Floyd, the tragedy of what that was, it really resonated with a lot of people who weren't in tune or aware of the issues that happen within the Black community as a relation in relation to the police. I think the brutality of what happened to George Floyd really was a wake-up call for a lot of people that wanted to kind of push it off their minds or push it away. So for Texas Southern, a campus full of majority Black students, not that all Black students on the campus think the same, but for the most part, it was like, yeah, it's tragic, but this has been happening. We're glad that other people are finally, from other groups of people, are finally like, we need to do something about it. Yeah.
Mhm. Have there been any instances of protests on campus or in Houston?
Not on campus, but definitely in Houston, in downtown Houston, there was several days of protests. And then the mayor of Houston, who is a Black man, he organized with several other groups. I can't remember all the names of them, but Black Lives Matter, a couple Houston rappers here who are very famous in the city and abroad. And they had a big march down to the Discovery Green area, which is the big city plaza type of situation where big events are held. The mayor spoke, the rappers I mentioned spoke, several other activists in the community spoke. So as I mentioned earlier, Houston's a very diverse city. So we kind of had that governmental backing to the issues. Of course, you had detractors, but for the most part, it was the city understands the issues that are going on in the disparities between Black people, Hispanic people, and white people, and everyone else.
Mhm. You mentioned that the government recognizes the racial disparity that there is, especially between African Americans and other racial groups as well. And especially Texas Southern University being a public university, do you think that the government understanding of this issue and their current take on the issue will influence any modifications to the curriculum or perhaps classes in the future at Texas Southern?
Well, unfortunately, as it is now, no. And there are classes, of course, that revolve around, the racial issues in this country from a multitude of backgrounds for at our university. But a lot of we have two problems mainly administration-wise at our university, and then a lot of the information that we can really do is dictated from the state. And like I said earlier, this is a red state, and our governor, Greg Abbott, and our Lieutenant Governor, Dan Patrick, are, let's just say, not the most forward-thinking gentlemen. So, at this point, it's not even trying to push a variety of educational classes. At this point, it's more just trying to fight for TSU to even continue being its own entity, as a variety of PWIs or predominantly white universities have been trying to encompass TSU. So unfortunately, we can't even focus on the things that you've asked, because we're trying to just fight to remain our own entity. So yeah, and that's, if I could just add, one thing I really enjoyed about HBU, because they had actually a Black Lives Matter class. They had these classes that I honestly wish were at Texas Southern University. And unfortunately, due to different circumstances and a different environment, we can't really focus on those right now.
Mhm. You mentioned earlier that many Texas Southern students seem to have an approach in response to the national issues that have occurred regarding the Black Lives Movement as it's just the same thing, yet it's just another new day, which to me is really heartbreaking. And I'd like to touch on perhaps student involvement, especially civic engagement in college classrooms. I understand that you worked as an intern for ABC News in September 2019 for the Democratic debates. And I think we also had some photos to feature as well of your work at the time at ABC News. So over here, we have a photo of the gymnasium and the arena being transformed at Texas Southern University for the 2019 Democratic debate. And then over here, we have a photo of the pre-production, which Merritt worked on to help the arena come together for the Democratic debate. And over here, we have a photo of a sign on campus at Texas Southern University helping to feature the debate. And over here, we have the scene lit up. The arena is all prepared for the candidates to come onto stage for the debate. And over here, we have a picture of Merritt on the stage for the presidential debate in 2019. Yes, I'd like to focus about some of your political and civic engagements on campus, especially as a political science major and someone who was involved in creating such a crucial event to come together for the future of our country. You mentioned earlier the somewhat passive, I wouldn't quite say passive, but this attitude among students that it's just another day of the same thing happening again. And I think that that's very heartbreaking to hear, just because it is such a heartbreaking issue.
Mhm.
And I think that having that kind of attitude that it's just the same thing, new day, really indicates that people have somewhat come to acceptance with it, but they're not quite happy with it. So could you describe perhaps the political involvement and the civic engagement that's present at Texas Southern University? Would you say that the university particularly encourages students to be more politically involved, or is there a strong inclination amongst students to become involved in issues such as the debates or voting?
Mhm. Well, there is definitely a strong presence on campus to get registered to vote, to go out and vote. And especially in these past few elections, 2018 and this upcoming election pre-coronavirus, there were a lot of political candidates, Beto, Kamala Harris, Biden. It was on the national news. He came to our university. And, you know, our generation, Generation Z, we've grown up seeing so much horrible stuff that we've kind of become desensitized and passive. And I think the more that we see candidates really just come on the ground, come to our university, show that you actually care, show that you want to be here, the more you'll get people engaged, because it quickly went from, okay, yeah, 2020, whatever, Trump's probably going to win, or this person's probably going to win, or I don't really care, to, you know, maybe I should go and vote. Maybe I should tell my friends to vote. I don't know what the outcome will be, but I need to be involved. And I truly feel like if you put your money where your mouth is, or your actions are louder than your words, then people will actually change. And at least in our generation, Generation Z, and on campus and my campus, and maybe HBU, people will become more politically active. Because I mean, you have to change the system within the system. I mean, very rarely is it changed from without.
Mhm. I love that you have the attitude towards that, that we definitely need to change in order to bring greater change in the system. And I hope that many other college students as well and the upcoming generations will also adopt a similar sentiment so that we can truly take charge of our future. This is actually all the time that we have for our show today, but I just wanted to thank you again, Merritt, and to thank you for watching ThinkTech Hawaii. We hope that today's program sheds some light on what life is like as a student at a historically Black college in Texas and what we can learn from one another through education around the country. Again, I'm Grace Laudick, and see you every other Thursday at noon. Aloha.